So hello again for another patron question and answer session, which I have quite a number here, so I better get going. Nicholas John Griffin says, hi, on the gun mantle of the Tiger 131, there's 3 sets of 2 small screws. What are they for? So that sent us hunting. So first of all, we were looking at the mantlet, but actually on the mantlet, there's another bit of a tube that comes forward, and there's these screws are actually there. So we'll do a quick cutaway for you, and so you can see that. The idea there is actually behind those screws, slightly further forward, there's a collar, and that's actually a seal. It's a rubber seal that's in there, so that again, it allows the gun to recoil, but doesn't allow dust, muck, and of course, if the tank had been submerged, water to go through, straight the way through, and then beyond the mantlet into the turret. So again, those screws are actually locating that collar in place. So hopefully answered that one. Philip Simonson says, is your Stridsvagn 103 RS tank operational, and if so, would you ever consider running it in the arena? Well, you've missed it. We did run it in the arena a few years back, so we've got some footage of it running around, and like many of the vehicles here, what tends to happen is we may well run a vehicle for a set period of time, and then it kind of goes off the running fleet for a bit, and I say a bit, it could be 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and then we'll perhaps recommission it so it can actually run. And at the moment, our S tank is actually in our tank factory exhibition, so it's not really available to run, but hopefully we'll find some of that footage of it actually running for you so you can see that going around. Phil J, he says here, I'm going to push my luck with a couple of questions, wondering if your restored Matilda was nearly finished restored Matilda was going to have a different name before Princess Anne turned up to actually do the opening, and or second question, would you consider doing an experience package allowing people to actually climb inside a number of tanks, or does health and safety, wear and tear, etc. make that a no-go? Back to Princess Anne coming, yes, if I'm entirely honest, we named it Princess Royal because Princess Anne was coming. What it was going to be called beforehand, I don't think we'd really made up our mind, but we like to sometimes pick a historic vehicle, or sometimes by using the name, it helps commemorate perhaps a particular event, a person or whatever. By Princess Royal coming down to actually open the workshops, that's why we decided to obviously call that vehicle Princess Royal. Second question there. The experience package idea, yes, it's a real problem for us all the time. Everybody would love to go in many more of the tanks that we have here, even to like the special event sort of thing, etc. The real problem we've got is, as you can imagine, you've kind of made it the points there, not just health and safety, because some of the tanks have got broken dials in, they've got radium, they may have asbestos, they're tanks that we seal, so not every tank you could even safely get in. But there's another angle, which is that word wear and tear. So we've got some lovely tanks with beautiful original interiors, but if everybody's stepping in over the top on that leather seat, that wear and tear to that leather seat, which may be already starting to perish. I've seen it myself, someone accidentally snagging their foot on some of the wiring that was slightly coming loose. Now, we can try and protect as best we can. We've done that with our First World War Mark IV tank. So we protected some of the areas, so if people are going in there, we don't wear away original surfaces or do too much damage. But it's the same as in the old days. You could have done cockpit days at some aircraft museums. Very rare to happen now, or they've got a secondary cockpit, not in the original, preserved our aircraft, and they're letting you in another one. Same with us. Perhaps in the old days we would have allowed that. That wear and tear builds up. There is a slight exception there, and that's because we're a training establishment for the military. And for example, if the military needs to know what it's like inside a T-72, that's one of our core functions, so we will let them inside a T-72. But for the general public, there's just so many people want to get in it, so that idea that, oh, please, please, I love this vehicle, you make an exception? You're one of many that we'd have to make an exception for, so on the whole, we don't let people inside, apart from 1 or 2 of the vehicles. Right, next question. Benjamin de Groot. Give no restrictions on overarching policies, shape of the displays. Would you, as curator of the Tank Museum, change anything about the current display collection? Would you add or remove specific vehicles, and why? Or alternatively, another question, I'll come on to that because your second question we answer elsewhere. So what do we think? My gut feeling is our issue here, 350 plus vehicles. You may have seen we've got our Vehicle Conservation Centre. We're already running out of room. We thought that would last a lot longer for us to expansion space. For me personally, I would love us to turn one of the galleries into a temporary exhibition space to allow us to much more regularly rotate vehicles from the Vehicle Conservation Centre or other storage areas, so that we could put on a much more regular basis groups of vehicles together so people can have a chance to have a closer look. They might only be there perhaps 6 months or over the winter or something, and then we'll swap them again for a different group. So we could put battle groups together, we could put periods together, we could put a whole selection of amphibious vehicles or APCs, or look at things in a funny sort of way, just a bit like what we've done with the Tiger display. Put certain themes or certain context, bring them together, and that would also bring them out from store, because the danger we got at the moment is some of those vehicles are going to go into the Vehicle Conservation Centre, and it might be a decade, 15 years, who knows, before we decide that vehicle's actually now going to come out. And if we only have gallery space for what you might call the top end stuff, you know, the stuff that's the epitome of that period or whatever, when will all those other second, third ranked vehicles or some of the experimental stuff find a way to get onto the main gallery floor so everyone can have a look at? So for me, that's what I'd love to see us to be able to do sometime in the future, is we're never going to have enough room for everything on the galleries, but let's find a way we can rotate. And as you can imagine, it's not just, I always do the analogy, the Teapot Museum. We can't just go and pick up a couple of teapots and swap them over. Moving tanks around is a bit more of a problem. It rips up the floor, you know, it takes a lot longer, and sometimes we can, if we're not careful, we can damage the vehicles as we're doing it. Your second question, by the way, I'll come on to what are we missing, what would we love, a bit further on. Bobby Gherkin says, I've seen photos of Sherman flamethrower tanks, both towing a Churchill Crocodile-style fuel trailer and without a trailer. Did the tanks without the trailer have an internal tank for flamethrower fuel? If they did, could they still mount and use a trailer, or were they distinctly different systems? Also, there are photos of Shermans with 2 barrels in the turret. Was a main gun in these still operational after the flamethrower barrel was installed? Well, made me to go and have a look at this. Probably the best book that takes you through all the American flamethrowers is Honeycutt's book on the Sherman, and what he explains there is just before the war the Americans were already doing experimentation with flamethrowers, as a number of other countries. At the beginning of the war, the warfare they looked at in North Africa, flamethrower, not that important, but as soon as it kicks off in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, etc., they realise the benefit of having a flamethrower in an armoured vehicle. So a number of experiments go on with the Americans. There's almost like 2 theatres of operation where experiments go on with flamethrowing tanks. One, the Pacific theatre. They've almost got things going on their own account. They're putting some tanks together in Hawaii. They're doing things that way. And of course, there's also, for the European theatre, they're also looking at it from that point of view. And these have slight crossovers, but they almost seem to be separate developments. What the Americans do, one of the first things they do is they look at a Canadian Ronson flamethrower system. They look at replacing the main armament with a flamethrower. They then decide that it's probably better to put that flamethrower in a casing that looked like a 75mm gun. There's another version where they put it in what would be the bow machine gun position and have fuel tanks inside. The first few experiments, smaller fuel tanks, hasn't got much range, and it doesn't have much in the way of fuel reserves. They're putting it, I think it's about 4.5% napalm into this fuel mix. And the whole idea of napalm is that it basically jellifies, so it gives a more viscous nature to the petrol, and that tends to mean you can get it further, and it also makes it stickier, so it sticks around, doesn't run away when it's on fire. Now they do this, they do a number of different versions, number of different experiments. They try the one in the bow. They also come up with a version that will go out through the the bow machine gunner's or the co-driver's position, but it goes up through his periscope fitting. So they're actually putting a flamethrower up through there. They're making small numbers of these. They do some experiments. Some do go out and see some service. They realise they need to expand the capacity. So again, they're looking at, they actually raise the turret basket in a Sherman tank to be able to put 3 or 2 separate tanks below the turret basket, and they even put a third tank within the turret basket. Again, it's getting capacity together for this napalm fuel they're going to be squirting. And the reason you see 2 barrels on some versions of the Sherman flamethrower is because, again, once they put the flamethrower there, immediately reports start coming back to say, hang on, it would be really useful to still be able to have a 75mm gun for other parts of the operation. In other words, defending yourself or firing high explosive. And that's why they do a mounting with the standard 75mm gun. And again, that flame gun is then put next to it, hence the 2 barrels on some versions. And why you've seen pictures, they also did an experiment. The Americans liked looking at the British crocodile. They're actually present at the very early crocodile experiments. Churchill tank, trailer behind. The Americans like the look of that. The crocodile goes off to Normandy and it has some early teething troubles. The Americans lose interest, and in August they cancel an order they've placed with the British for actually putting crocodile trailers and the crocodile system through a Sherman tank. Only 6 are made, and actually 4 of those go out and see service in Northwest Europe. As soon as they're there, change their minds. They realise how useful these vehicles are, and certainly the Americans are really grateful for 79th Armoured Division crocodiles being used. So they change their mind. They're a bit too late. By the time they actually get this process going again, already the British are busy with their own orders, and it doesn't really actually work before the end. But that's why you'll also see versions of Sherman tanks with a crocodile trailer behind. That was again, and the British, by the way, we did one called Adder. Can't remember the second name of the second one, but we did experiments by using the Sherman and putting flame equipment in it ourselves. They did a number of versions of it. They don't go actually out into service, but there's a number of experiments that go on even to after the war. So slightly confusing. There's no easy one answer to that, but actually hopefully that explains that idea behind how the Americans are actually trying to put flame-throwing stuff in Sherman tanks. Next question, Josh Salazar, he's asked, I was watching the Fury video you posted earlier. I wanted to know, would the Fury's gun penetrate the armour of a Tiger 1? And basically, yes. A 76mm gun firing normal armour-piercing rounds, that could go through 109mm of armour plate. And if you think Tiger 1s on the front have 100mm of armour plate, so technically the standard round. The key issue though is the Americans are starting to fire HVAP rounds in that 76mm gun. That's called high velocity armour piercing rounds. They have Morwelly behind them, they have a tungsten core, and one of those HVAP rounds could go through 178mm of armour at about 1,000 metres. And that means, again, you've got that extra penetration. So technically, yes, those 76mm guns on our Sherman, like the Fury movie one, they could penetrate the front armour of a Tiger 1. Actually, if you remember in the movie, the point is they're trying to actually get round the back of it so they can penetrate the thinner armour on the rear of the tank. That's what's in that shot there. So, and you finish as well saying something about actually sometimes rounds were so powerful they could pass right through a Sherman without touching the crew and leaving them to escape. One of the issues here that again we point out, and I was just talking to a veteran literally this week, the danger of a round penetrating the armour and then rattling around inside, that's what does the damage. The chances of a round penetrating your armour and then exiting is probably better for the crew, because then you don't get this idea of this round rattling around, doing an awful lot of damage, decapitating a crew member, doing horrible things inside. So if you are penetrated, it is much better for you that that round goes all the way out the other side. It can still cause damage, of course, and it might still hit a crew member, but actually on the whole, you were better off if the round exited than actually started going around inside. Right, whipping over, we've got only 2 more to go, don't worry. Max Luo, tanks on the modern battlefield. One of the points he's trying to sort of say is tank technologies developed to take on other tanks, and then even further technology developed to take those tanks. His point being, tank development seems like a closed loop. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. With the advent of other technologies, have we still got a use for the tank on the battlefield? Well, one of the points that we often say is when you look at, again, the history of the museum, looking through the armour, etc., we come up with an idea, the enemy comes up a way of defeating that technology or that idea. So you adapt your technology or your idea to actually come over the top there, and you become valid again till the enemy end up creating something to counter your new idea. So the example we often give, the Syrian military were using T-72 tanks in Damascus some years ago. they were getting knocked out by guys with RPGs, etc. They changed their tactics. Now, early on, they were said, you know, there was newspaper headlines, accounts, that's the end of the tank. Look, these guys doing all this, you can't use a tank in an urban area, etc. The Syrian military learned the lesson, changed their tactics, did some technological innovations, added other vehicles with those tanks so that they could cover doorways, etc. They're now using tanks much more effectively in the urban area. So that history of one technology being invented, being used effectively till another technology or tactic comes along to defeat it, goes on all the time. The key point though about the modern battlefield and this idea that you can have attack helicopters, you can have all sorts of clever ways of defeating armour at the same time. Armoured vehicles, tanks have mobility, firepower and protection. Three things every soldier's ever wanted throughout history. So those three things will really rarely ever disappear from the battlefield. And again, very few items can actually do what a tank does on the battlefield. The helicopter has to go home. The tank can stay there. As my colleague David Fletcher famously said, you can attack a helicopter with a tin opener. You can't do that with a tank. So that idea about whatever we've seen, and again, the museum is full of the history of the tank, ways of defeating a tank. Oh, the end of the tank, forget it, we're not going to use them anymore that way. Peculiarly or logically, they changed the tactics, changed the technology, and the next minute we're using those vehicles again. They seem to have a life. And again, 5-10 years ago, would we ever thought tanks are going to be used in the way they are at the moment? Look at tanks are being used in the Ukraine. Look at the way they're being used all around the world again in a manner that, again, not that long ago, we would have said, well, maybe that's the end of it. And even older tanks being brought out, upgraded, or being used again because they're still functional, they still have a role, and they can still help win a battle, and that's really important. So they're going to be here to stay. That's my prediction. And again, at the end here, we've got Interceptor 57. One of the questions he's asking, which refers to an earlier one, is what vehicle would the Tank Museum have most interest in acquiring? What are we really interested in? So we have something here. I'm the curator, but we have a board of trustees, and we actually put together under those board of trustees committees. We have something called a collection committee. So it's not just whatever me or the director or someone comes along and says, listen, wouldn't it be great we get one of these today? Actually, the idea is we actually think through, we look at our collecting policy, our remit, what is it that we want to collect and what are we missing? If we want to be the best tank museum in the world, what fills that gap? So we've actually got a list of our wants. And that doesn't just include armour, as in key tanks that we still haven't got here, and obvious ones I'd mentioned. We haven't got a Leopard 2 in the collection. We haven't got a Merkava. We haven't got a Leclerc in terms of some of these moderner ones. We're still missing. We'd love a late war heavy Russian tank like a JS2 or JS3 or maybe even post-war T10. We haven't got some of the Soviet bits missing. A PT-76 would be quite useful, I think. So there's vehicles there. And there's a lot as well of wheeled armour as well, that's very important. And as more and more vehicles are developed or produced, one thing we've tried to say to ourselves, we're never going to get these great big families of vehicles. You only have to think of things like Piranha or Striker, all these LAV vehicles, all that tend to go back to one particular parent body vehicle. So that's what we're thinking we're aiming for. We won't get everything, but let's get those key parent vehicles or the epitome of their type. So recently we've just been able to acquire from BAE Systems a Piranha. That was that MOWAG Piranha, starts off in Switzerland, but it was sold and built all around the world in different versions. It's the American Striker underneath that, the Canadians have a version, etc. So lots of countries did that. So it's things like that. So we've got that list together in terms of what we're out, and I'm quite excited at the moment because one of the vehicles on our list, which I won't mention yet till we've definitely got it secure here, we think we are about to acquire. So we are looking for those vehicles on that list, and those are ones. And of course, there's going to be all sorts of things we won't always put on the list, but they may come out the woodwork and things that way. For me personally, I think it's not always the big glamorous tanks that are going to be it. Sometimes there's vehicles. There was a British armoured car called a Morris CS9 that was being used in France in 1940. As far as I'm aware, I don't think one exists anywhere. And yet it's one of those vehicles that, again, out in France at Arras, it was being used by the cavalry. It was flanking. It's in some of the early photographs. Wouldn't it be great to get vehicles like that, complete rarities that touch on an area we so often overlook, into the collection here. Because don't forget, we are the British Tank Museum. We have a bit of a hierarchy of what we want to collect and why. It starts with the British stuff, allies we fight with, and enemies we fight against. And again, there's another category really of technical innovation. So there's a lot of stuff we love out there. For me personally, it's some of that obscure British stuff that would be lovely to see. If one of those came to light, great for us. But we do actually have a wants list so that somebody like myself doesn't just sort of say, oh, let's go and buy a tank in blue today instead of a tank in pink. No, we've got what we want to acquire. So I think that's the end of all our questions at the moment this time. So as ever, thank you for supporting us. Keep have a look. We've got some other interesting videos coming out fairly soon. And thank you again from the Tank Museum.